One of the next steps is creating depth. And this is really critical. We've kind of created some depth by pushing things up on the page with the drop shadows. We've created a nice asymmetrical box to kind of change it. It might actually not be what we're going to design in the page, but it's kind of fun to play with. Really, the next level is creating a little bit more depth from one side to another, and this is where we can use transparency. Transparency comes in two forms in CSS. The first one is the use of opacity. The second one is the use of the alpha channel. Opacity is really great technique. It's a lot of fun, and the code to use it is really, really simple. It is copy and paste in line 42. It says opacity and then a basic number. So 1, if I do 1, of course, nothing's going to happen. Let's reload. If I hit 0, it's going to disappear. And if I hit 0.5, it's going to be 50% transparency. One of the things that you're going to have to realize with opacity, and it's really, really powerful, let's say I even change it to 0.25, so 0.25%, is that when I use it, it actually makes everything opaque. So even if I go in and say, I would like a border, here's my famous line of code everyone's going to get used to, 1 pick solid red, and I load in a border, that border is also going to be opaque. It's a lot of fun. So one of the things I could do if I really wanted to, let's see what happens when I add a background image to see, does it make that opaque too? So let's go back to our previous style guide. I have a wonderful background image that we've created. I'm going to add it into our div just out of sheer curiosity to see what it's going to do. And when I reload it, it also makes that wonderful starry-eyed image that we had in our previous example. It makes it opaque too. This is great because now I can, if you think about it, I might be able to start overlaying transparencies, overlaying different pieces of the page. It's also really flexible because, of course, it's being fluid with the page design, but it's not really useful. And by useful, I say that it's not useful because the text inside of it disappears. So really it's beginning to mean not so helpful for us, especially if I'm going to be using this for layout. I might want to sort of make things certain things transparent, certain pieces of text transparent, maybe even a background. This is where it's really sort of not the most helpful thing in the world. So we have to actually take a step back and say, well, opacity is wonderful, it's amazing, but I can't really use it that much. So I'm going to take the opacity off right now, and we're going to look at the next piece of this. So I said that there's two methods of transparency. The first one is the opacity, and the next one is the alpha channel. So I'm going to really want to make the white disappear and be nice and fluid. I'm going to go back to my wonderful examples. You notice that I've created my reference library, and I'm going to pull out what's referred to as RGBA. Previous, when we were talking about color, I'd said that there were 3 methods of using color. And really, 2 of them are really the same. 2 of them are the use of hex code values and web-safe colors. And I'd said the second one that I'd love to use, which I wouldn't recommend, is using the keywords, which were red, green, black, the primary colors. And then I'd said that the second one was RGB. RGB is a really amazing and wonderful because what it is it's an ability in CSS3 for you to take RGB values directly from a Photoshop file and plug them in. So you're no longer taking the hex codes and trying to find a translation from one to the other. The problems with hex codes, if you're in between an F and an E, and each of them represents a phase of color, there's no in between. So RGB was added in CSS 3.0 styles to actually get that wonderful smoothness of colors. Again, I'm back at CSS 3 Maker. I'm going to try to move a couple of things. Not really too exciting. I mean, it's really nice. I can get colors, and you notice that the RGB values. I'm really interested in the most important value, which is opacity. And one of the things that I'm going to do is this is not using the opacity code. It's actually using the alpha channel based in color itself to create that transparency. So in this case, I'm going to take the background color. I'm going to use background color RGBA, A being the last color of the transparency. And I'm going to say, let's double check that I make sure I get rid of this. Let's get rid of this old background color that I have here and save it. I'm actually going to look at it. Of course, it's going to use the typical background color that we see in CSS 1.0 that we've talked about. And then the new value is the RGBA, which being the fourth channel, which is the alpha channel, the opacity channel. So of course, the 255 is the full white value. And of course, if you use any color picker, Photoshop, Illustrator, Fireworks, even there are web-based pickers that allow you to pick colors off screens. You're going to notice that it's all going to give you a range of 0 to 255. It's going to pretty much be RGB, and then here's that wonderful opacity at the end of it, which of course, just like the opacity that we use in CSS, it's going to be based off 0 and 1. So I'm going to save this. I'm going to go back to my page, and when I reload it, I get some transparency on the page. Of course, it's really, really hard to see because I'm actually a white against white background. So why don't we get this down to like a 0.25. I reload it, and then you notice it starts being more and more transparent. But I think what we should do to really see this come home is temporarily, I'm going to change this background to black. I'm going to reload it. I'm going to save it. Oh, I think I might be on a different channel, but let's make sure that, oh, you know what? I actually have to be careful. I set 2 background colors. So of course, I want to make sure that doesn't happen. I'm going to set this here. Again, catching some of my own mistakes. Again, remember, the simple mistakes are the ones you trip over. Let's reload it. Here's black. And you notice here's my transparency of 0.25. I'm going to put these side by side. I could actually have done this in the inspector for fun. So what I'm going to do is change this back to 7.5 and save it, reload. And there's my transparency coming in again. One of the great things about this is you notice that what doesn't become transparent is the text color doesn't become transparent. It becomes solid. It's still solid. The opacity is only happening in the background color. So what if I wanted to actually make the text color just opaque itself? So maybe we're going to use, in this example, I'm going to use 1. I'm going to copy my RGBA values. I'm going to save this. Let's reload it. So again, it's 100%, opacity. It's of course completely solid. But I want to make the text itself. Here's where I can actually use the color variable that we learned about and said, instead of putting hex code, why don't we put in, I'll put in 0, 0, 0. This is going to load it in as black. And now let's go in and say 0.75. I reload it, and you now notice my text is nice and transparent. I can also apply this same thing to my border color. So this is what's really cool. If I actually did want to take it into some, I'm just going to type in a random color in between, just because why not? We're here experimenting. You and I are playing together with CSS. So why don't we change this to 0.5%, reload the page. I'll maybe even make this border 4 so that we can see the transparency at work. Here you go. It's kind of a mute color in between, but now it's transparent. One of the things that this is very selective. This is sort of kind of that sniper approach. I'm trying to hit one little tiny little target. Versus the one thing to be very careful about with using the regular opacity is that if you put, again, cascading style sheets, if you put that opacity inside a div or you put opacity inside a paragraph tag, everything you put in that div, every text, every link, every other code, it's all going to become opaque. So again, this is where we really want to be with very, very subtle design changes. This is where we start playing with design in order to start thinking about how we're going to use a very macro or a very micro approach at color and transparency. So this really depends on the design.